Good evening and welcome to the Sleepy Geographer. If you're listening right now, it's time to let the world slow down a little, to trade the noise of the day for something gentler. You've found a quiet corner of the map where geography turns into a bedtime story. Tonight's journey drifts through the haunting calm of ghost cities, places where streets stretch on without footsteps, where towers glow but no one lives behind the light, and where ambition, economics, and time itself have left their quiet fingerprints on the landscape. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? It's always fascinating to see the little constellation of places this channel reaches. If you enjoy these slow, thoughtful journeys, I'd be grateful if you could give the video a gentle like and subscribe. And to those who already have, thank you. You're helping this sleepy corner of geography stay alive and growing. Now, I'll do my best not to make this episode too interesting, though if it accidentally keeps you awake, at least you'll wake up a little wiser about why some cities fall silent. So settle in, breathe slow, and let your thoughts wander through the quiet avenues of the world's forgotten places. Why do cities, built with such care and hope, sometimes vanish almost overnight, leaving only echoes behind? Imagine standing in the middle of an empty boulevard, the kind designed for parades and morning markets. The air is still, the buildings perfect, yet every sound feels amplified. A flag rustling, a loose sign tapping in the wind. This is the strange geography of abandonment, where space and silence meet. Throughout history, cities have been living organisms. They grow, adapt, and sometimes fade. But disappearance rarely means destruction. More often, it's transformation. Tonight, we'll wander through ancient capitals swallowed by sand, mining towns left hollow when the seams ran dry, and modern skylines waiting for people who never quite arrived. A ghost city isn't always a ruin. Sometimes it's brand new, all glass and concrete, yet somehow asleep. Other times it's a city preserved by accident, frozen mid-motion by disaster, or sealed off by borders drawn too suddenly. Every one of them tells us something about how humans build, hope, and move on. We'll trace the forces behind this quieting, shifting trade routes that starved ports of purpose, rivers that changed their course and left towns stranded, industries that roared until their engines stopped, and economies that built faster than they could fill. Geography, as it turns out, has a long memory. By following these places, we'll learn how landscapes record human ambition, and how nature, patient and unhurried, begins to take everything back. You'll hear of vanished empires, new cities without citizens, and the fine line between progress and overreach. So as the night deepens and the world outside drifts into stillness, we begin at the edge of the map, where the lights once shone brightly, and where, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the echo of a city breathing in its sleep. Not every silent city is the same kind of silence. Some are truly abandoned, emptied out, left to dust and ivy, the faint hum of insects replacing the noise of traffic. Others still hold people, just not enough of them. Windows are lit here and there, but most floors stay dark. Then there are the seasonal cities, swelling with life when the weather is right, then slipping into hibernation when the crowds or crops disappear. And finally, there are the exclusion zones, the places where the boundary itself is the reason for emptiness. Each of these tells a different story, but all share a common thread. The landscape outlasts its purpose. Geographers tend to be careful with language, so defining a ghost city is not as simple as counting rooftops. A completely deserted settlement like Kolmanskop in Namibia, a mining town half swallowed by dunes, fits neatly into the image most people imagine. But what about a brand new district of apartment towers, sparkling and paved, where only a handful of residents actually live? Or a coastal resort where half the lights flicker on for 2 months a year? The difference between abandoned and under-occupied may seem like semantics, but in geography, those distinctions tell us how the forces of economy, policy and environment intertwine. At one end of the spectrum sits abandonment in the truest sense, when a place no longer has permanent inhabitants. This can happen because of disaster, exhaustion of resources, or a simple shift in what the land offers. Gold runs out, wells dry up, or trade routes move elsewhere. What remains are walls and streets slowly giving into time. In the middle are the shrinking towns, where the population curve has been declining year after year. Shops close, schools consolidate, bus routes vanish one by one. The rhythm of daily life slows until you can almost hear the pause between footsteps. Then come the partially occupied places, still inhabited but oddly still. In these, the number of buildings has grown faster than the number of people to fill them. Urban planners sometimes call this a land-use mismatch. You can see it from space, sprawling housing estates with perfect road grids and a scattering of cars, but few signs of life. It is not decay, at least not yet. It is more like a city holding its breath, waiting for the population that never quite arrived. And finally, there are the exclusion zones, where emptiness isn't caused by economic failure or decline, but by decision. Some are fenced off for safety, like Chernobyl's radioactive perimeter, or the volcanic zones of Montserrat. Others are frozen by politics, buffer regions between nations, demilitarized areas, or towns left stranded behind a ceasefire line. These aren't ghostly through neglect, but through order. Places where laws, not nature, keep people out. The silence feels different there, structured, deliberate, uneasy. To understand any of these kinds of emptiness, geographers turn to data that can whisper about presence even when people are gone. Population counts are the obvious starting point, but they're slow to change and often miss the nuance of how decline unfolds. Instead, researchers watch for subtler signs, like the dimming of nightlights in satellite imagery. If an area once bright on global maps of illumination starts to fade year after year, it tells a story of departure. Postal address data can do the same. When fewer households receive mail, or when businesses deregister, the gap widens. Even utility consumption, the electricity or water used per grid square, can reveal an invisible migration. From above, abandoned regions take on their own signatures. Roofs fade from uniform grey to patchy brown as tiles fall and vegetation creeps in. Streets begin to show cracks where weeds push through asphalt. Some scientists use machine learning models trained to detect exactly that pattern, the slow fractal takeover of plants, as a quantitative signal of decline. It's oddly poetic that life returning to stone can serve as measurable data. These clues matter because emptiness itself is a moving target. A town might appear ghostly at one moment, but later revive through tourism or relocation programs. Conversely, a city that seems vibrant could already be hollowing out from within. A falling birth rate, a shrinking industrial base, or the gradual loss of amenities can all preface silence long before the streets are empty. Geography reads these patterns like a pulse, noting not just what's visible but what's changing beneath the surface. It's important to remember too that ghost city is not an insult or a label of failure. It's a phase in the life cycle of settlement. Some places rest quietly before finding a new purpose. Others dissolve back into soil and sand, completing the loop. From the world's oldest ruins to half-finished modern mega-projects, each carries lessons about how quickly human ambition can outpace sustainability. And finally, a small clarification. This isn't the thrill-seeking side of urban exploration. The aim here isn't to romanticize decay or hunt for the eerie, but to listen carefully to geography's slow language. Abandonment isn't just mystery, it's information. It tells us about the delicate balance between people and place, about how environments reward or reject human plans, and about how the map is never as fixed as we imagine. A ghost city, then, is not defined by the absence of life, but by the presence of change. It's the still point between creation and collapse, where the human story pauses and the earth quietly turns the page. Long before skyscrapers and suburbs, there were cities so old that their streets now lie beneath layers of soil. They were not destroyed by invaders or erased in an instant. They simply faded gently over time. The first ghost cities were born not from catastrophe, but from quiet change. Shifts in climate, food, and the rhythms of trade that slowly untied the knots of human settlement. In southern Anatolia lies one of the world's earliest examples of urban density, Çatalhöyük. Around 9,000 years ago, this Neolithic community was home to several thousand people, packed into mud brick houses so closely that there were no streets at all. Residents entered their homes through the roof, climbing down ladders into rooms warmed by hearths and decorated with murals. It was a city before cities, a dense hive of early farmers and artisans. Yet over centuries, its people dispersed. There was no sign of war, no great fire or mass exodus. The soil layers show continuity, not calamity. Archaeologists believe the cause was subtler. The land around the settlement simply changed. As fields became exhausted and herds needed new pasture, small groups began drifting outward to form smaller villages. The story of Çatalhöyük is less about abandonment and more about evolution. It marks the moment when humans learned that density has limits, that communities sometimes thrive better when they spread out. Social structure likely played a role too. As households became more independent, the tightly packed living style may have felt less necessary, perhaps even stifling. The result was not a tragedy, but a natural reorganization, the world's first lesson in urban overreach. Thousands of years later, on the plains of what is now Pakistan, another great city would meet its own quiet end. Mohenjo-Daro, one of the jewels of the Indus Valley civilization, was remarkable in its precision. Straight streets formed a careful grid, and houses had private wells and drainage, a level of urban planning the world wouldn't see again for millennia. Yet by around 1900 BCE, the city began to decline. Archaeologists once imagined invasion or plague, but the landscape itself holds the likelier culprit. The Indus River, the city's lifeline, shifted its course. Rivers in flat floodplains wander over time, a process known as avulsion. And when one channel dries while another forms miles away, entire economies are stranded. A navigable river isn't just a water source, it's a road, a marketplace, a refrigerator, and a boundary all in one. As the Indus changed direction, Mohenjo-Daro's harbour filled with silt, and trade with Mesopotamia slowed. At the same time, the regional climate became more arid, shrinking harvests and forcing populations to migrate toward the still moist Gangetic plains. No disaster struck. The city simply found itself on the wrong side of geography. Without its river, its reason for existing dissolved. Far to the east, in the tropical heat of Cambodia, Angkor tells a grander, wetter version of the same story. Built between the 9th and 15th centuries, Angkor was once the largest urban complex on Earth. It was not just a city, but a vast engineered landscape. Canals, moats, and reservoirs spreading across hundreds of square kilometres. This hydraulic system captured monsoon rain and distributed it across rice fields, allowing the Khmer Empire to feed hundreds of thousands of people. Water was power, both literal and symbolic. Temples like Angkor Wat were aligned to the heavens and mirrored in shimmering ponds, a union of the sacred and the practical. But even the most sophisticated system has limits. Over time, the canals silted up, reservoirs cracked, and the delicate balance of water and earth faltered. climate records show that Southeast Asia suffered alternating periods of severe drought and heavy monsoon during the 14th and 15th centuries. Drought starved the canals, floods then overwhelmed them. Repairing such a massive network required constant labour and stable governance, both of which weakened as the empire declined. Angkor didn't die overnight. It unravelled, reservoir by reservoir, as water management that once sustained life began to fail it. Eventually, the royal court moved south toward Phnom Penh, closer to the Mekong's trade routes, leaving behind a forested labyrinth of stone and silence. The story of Petra, hidden among the canyons of southern Jordan, feels almost mythic in comparison. Known as the Rose-Red City half as old as time, it flourished between the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE as the capital of the Nabatean kingdom. Its wealth came from geography. Petra sat at the crossroads of caravan routes linking Arabia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. The city's facades were carved directly into sandstone cliffs, blending architecture with geology in a way few places ever have. Yet even beauty couldn't defy the shifting currents of trade. As maritime routes grew safer and more profitable, merchants increasingly favoured sea lanes over desert caravans. Goods that once wound through Petra's wadis began to sail past on ships hugging the Red Sea coast. The city's lifeblood trickled away, and then earthquakes in the 4th and 6th centuries damaged its already fading infrastructure. By the Middle Ages, Petra was a whisper among travellers' tales, magnificent but forgotten. The land itself had moved on, rerouting both rivers and relevance. Seen together, these ancient cities form a quiet chorus about the fragility of human geography. Çatalhöyük shows how social and subsistence choices reshape where people live. Mohenjo-Daro reminds us that a single river's whim can undo centuries of planning. Angkor demonstrates the double-edged sword of engineering mastery, and Petra stands as a monument to the restless nature of trade. Each, in its own way, teaches that cities are only as permanent as the landscapes and systems they depend upon. If you could lay a modern map over those vanished worlds, the contrast would be striking. Reconstructed waterways rarely align with today's rivers. Ports that once welcomed ships now sit far inland. Ancient harbours lie buried beneath fields, and the great canals of Angkor trace ghostly lines beneath forest canopies visible only from satellites. Geography, it seems, keeps no promises of permanence. In the end, the earliest ghost cities weren't destroyed. They were outgrown, outmaneuvered, or outlasted by the Earth itself. They are reminders that even the grandest designs must bend to changing water, climate, and trade. Beneath their ruins, the soil quietly holds the memory of where human ambition met the slow, steady patience of nature, and lost gracefully. Every city is in some way a conversation with its terrain. Where we build and where we abandon depend not just on human decisions, but on the quiet physics of the earth beneath our feet. The shape of the land, the slope of a valley, the reach of a river, these are the subtle cartographers of human destiny. Geography doesn't shout, it nudges. It doesn't dictate what a city must do, but it heavily hints at what a city can do. In the desert, those hints are stark. Settlements cling to the presence of groundwater like ivy to a wall. An aquifer beneath the sand can sustain life for centuries, but once that hidden river begins to fall, a city thins out like a drying oasis. Across North Africa and Central Asia, the ghosts of old caravan towns still line the ancient routes, places that once thrived on trade, now swallowed by dunes. The secret of their existence lay in wadis, those ephemeral riverbeds that flood in short bursts and stay dry the rest of the year. They were both lifeline and trap. Too little rain, and wells went brackish. Too much, and whole districts could be swept away in minutes. In the desert, geography is always a negotiation between thirst and flood. Take the ancient city of Merv, deep in what is now Turkmenistan. For centuries it flourished as a glittering stop on the Silk Road, an oasis built on meticulous irrigation from the Murgab River. But its success was as fragile as the channels that fed it. Overuse and neglect led those waterways to clog with silt, and when the river shifted course, Merv was stranded. The canals dried, and the once green fields turned to sand. The remains today lie like a mirage, vast, symmetrical, and utterly still. The desert gave the city life, and with a small change in flow, it quietly took it back. Coastal cities live by an equally delicate balance. Ports are only as strong as the land that holds them, and the water that reaches them. Many once prosperous harbours now sit high and dry because of siltation, rivers bringing more sediment than the sea can carry away. Over centuries, the same process that builds fertile deltas also buries shipping channels. Medieval Bruges in Belgium was once one of the richest ports in Europe, until its lifeline, the Zwin estuary, slowly filled with sand. The sea retreated, and with it went the merchants. The city didn't fall, it simply faded inland. Elsewhere, the land itself is on the move. Barrier islands along coastlines like the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic seaboard are constantly migrating landward as waves and storms redistribute sand. Settlements built on these shifting foundations face an impossible task: to pin down something that wants to wander. Add to that subsidence, the natural sinking of land due to groundwater withdrawal or sediment compression, and suddenly the sea seems taller than it used to be. Relative sea level rise, the combined effect of sinking land and rising water, can quietly erase a coastline faster than any storm. Entire fishing villages have had to retreat inland as their streets become tidal pools. Geography, patient but relentless, always reclaims the edge. Mountains too have their own brand of tyranny. They create natural fortresses but also natural prisons. For every settlement protected by cliffs and high passes, there's another that found itself too well hidden. Valleys that once buzzed with life can turn silent when winter roads become impassable, or when trade routes find easier ground elsewhere. The medieval city of Hampi in southern India offers a vivid example. Tucked among dramatic granite boulders beside the Tungabhadra River, it was once a thriving capital of the Vijayanagara Empire. Its terrain made it defensible, but also difficult. When the empire fell in the 16th century, rebuilding there proved nearly impossible. The same rocks that had guarded the city now stood in the way of its renewal. Over time, vines took over the pillars, and the temples merged with the hills from which they were born. Landslides, avalanches, and snowbound passes can isolate mountain communities for months. Some adapt, storing food and fuel to endure the long stillness. Others eventually give up, drawn down into gentler valleys by the pull of accessibility. Geography gives, but convenience decides. Once a new tunnel or pass opens, trade routes pivot instantly, leaving behind quiet inns and forgotten villages clinging to the old road. Rivers, however, are the master architects of both creation and loss. They are restless, always adjusting their courses through meander migration, that slow, looping dance across floodplains. When a river swings away, a harbour is abandoned. When it cuts a new channel, farmland turns to swamp. Ancient maps reveal these movements like wrinkles in the landscape. Entire towns have been stranded miles from the water they once depended on. In China's North Plain, for instance, the Yellow River's notorious shifts have rewritten the human geography of the region many times over. Each time it floods, it redraws the logic of settlement. And then there are the human attempts to control that restlessness. Levees, those long earthen walls designed to keep rivers in check, create winners and losers. They protect some fields while starving others of fresh silt. One bank thrives, the opposite side erodes. Every engineering decision is also a geographical one, shaping where people can safely stay and where they quietly move away. If you could trace all these forces on a simple relief map, the ridges, the floodplains, the dry basins and the wandering rivers, you would see the skeleton of civilization itself. The corridors are where movement flows easily, along coasts, valleys and deltas. The barriers are where friction slows everything down. The deserts, the mountains, the places where water vanishes or piles too deep. The concept geographers call the friction of distance might sound abstract, but it governs nearly every decision humans make about settlement. It explains why towns cluster near crossroads and fade at the end of difficult roads, why cities hug rivers but avoid their swamps, and why the emptying of one well can change 1,000 lives. In the end, the terrain doesn't play favourites. It welcomes and withdraws with equal grace. The same slope that once made a perfect defensive wall might later cause an avalanche. The same delta that nourished crops for centuries might, with one shift in the tides, flood the fields entirely. When a city falls silent, the ground beneath it often holds the reason. Mountains close their passes, rivers change their minds, deserts move their sand, and the coast redraws its own line. The earth has never stopped reshaping the stage. It's humanity that sometimes forgets the script was never ours to write. Every empty street begins as a busy one. A ghost city never turns silent overnight. It fades, like music played slower and slower, until the notes dissolve into air. The process isn't dramatic, it's domestic. It happens in kitchens and bus stops, in school corridors and small decisions made around dinner tables. Abandonment, in reality, is built from ordinary moments when people quietly decide to stop coming back. Imagine waking up in a town that's thinning out. The first sign isn't decay, it's silence. The morning bus, once crowded with commuters, now hums with empty seats. The timetable has been shortened, one driver reassigned, then another. Routes that used to connect districts are cut for efficiency, leaving those without cars suddenly much farther from everything that matters. A 5-minute ride becomes a half-hour walk, then an hour. Eventually the habit of going anywhere at all begins to fade. Around the same time, the corner bakery closes. The owner posts a polite note thanking loyal customers and promising to reopen if things pick up again. The oven's cool, and the smell of fresh bread that once drifted down the street is replaced by the faint scent of dust and plaster. With no daily reason to stroll that way, foot traffic drops, and the cafe across the square loses its morning crowd too. The town's social rhythm, its heartbeat, slows without anyone officially announcing it. Every household runs its own quiet calculations. Is the commute still worth it? Is there enough work nearby? Does the tap water still run clean? When the school merges with another one 30 kilometers away, some parents move to be closer. Others stay, driving longer each morning until fuel prices make that impossible. One by one, families weigh the trade-offs and tip the scales toward leaving. Geography makes the arithmetic tangible. More distance means more time and eventually more absence. There's a threshold, a tipping point invisible on maps but well known to sociologists and planners. The moment when a settlement loses the minimum number of people needed to sustain shared services. Below that, the network effect of community begins to unravel. The post office shuts because there aren't enough letters. The clinic closes because there aren't enough patients to justify a nurse. Once the grocery shop is gone, food becomes a weekly expedition instead of a daily errand. For those who remain, life stretches thin, like a fabric pulled too tight to cover the same ground. It's a strange paradox. People often want to stay precisely because it's home, but home itself relies on the presence of others. Community is a collective phenomenon, you can't have it alone. When numbers drop, everything that depends on them, from football clubs to choir groups, falters. The local paper stops printing because advertisers lose interest. Without the small rituals of togetherness, the town feels larger but emptier. Streets that once felt friendly start to echo, yet decline isn't always gloomy. There's a certain poetry to the slowness of it. Plants take over window boxes that haven't been tended, vines curl up telephone poles, and silence returns to places that once hummed with engines. Even in human absence, the world keeps busy. It repairs itself quietly. For geographers, these patterns tell a story about thresholds, the point where geography stops serving convenience and begins to test endurance. You can see it most clearly in market squares. Picture one on a late afternoon, the kind paved with stones worn smooth by centuries of trade. Once there were 10 stalls lined with baskets of fruit, bolts of fabric, and the comfortable chatter of bargaining. Now there are 2, then 1, and finally none. Each week another vendor decides the profit isn't worth the drive. When the last stall disappears, the wind has the space to move through unbroken. Dust spirals where the smell of oranges used to hang. Even the pigeons, finding less to scavenge, drift to busier towns. Transport geographers sometimes call this phenomenon spatial thinning. Services and people retreat together, each depending on the other, each accelerating the other's absence. It's the reverse of growth, the invisible unspooling of the threads that once tied households into a single organism. Where there were once daily paths, children walking to school, workers heading to the mill, there are now only occasional footprints. Overhead, satellite data begins to notice it too. Nightlights dim by fractions of a percent. Rooftops fade to duller shades, and vegetation starts creeping into the gaps. But there's tenderness in that observation. For those who stay behind, life takes on a slower rhythm that some find peaceful. With fewer cars, the air feels clearer. With fewer neighbours, the stars come back. Old houses become generous with space. The challenge is isolation, but also the opportunity to adapt. Turning the old schoolhouse into a community hall, the empty shop into a shared garden. Geography, after all, never completely closes its doors, it just changes the conditions for living. Still, once the social density falls below a certain point, even resilience has limits. A settlement that loses critical mass starts to experience feedback loops. Services vanish, prompting departures, which lead to more closures. Economists model it in equations, geographers can see it from the sky. But on the ground it feels simple. It's when the bus stops coming, when the phone box is removed, when the bakery sign fades, and when the sound of your own footsteps becomes the loudest thing on the street. If you stood in that quiet market square today, you might still hear traces of what was. The memory of a bell, a snatch of conversation, the rhythm of carts over cobbles. Human presence lingers in architecture longer than in population. Each house is a diary of small decisions, of people who balance convenience against belonging until the scales finally tipped. The city doesn't die, it just exhales, letting the wind take over the spaces where words and laughter once filled the air. And perhaps that's the truest marker of decline. Not the crumbling walls or the cracked pavement, but the disappearance of ordinary noise, the quiet of a place where the last loaf has been baked, the last bus has rolled out, and the last school bell has rung. What remains isn't ruin, it's pause, a geography of waiting where the land rests for a while before deciding what to do next. When people leave, the buildings are what we see first, the empty houses, the faded shop fronts, the grass edging across pavements. But beneath that surface lies something quieter and stranger, the infrastructure that stays. Roads, rails, ports, power lines and pipes, linger long after daily life has packed up. They are the bones of a city designed to endure generations, and when the flesh of community fades, those bones remain, humming faintly with a memory of motion. Start with the roads. Every map holds its ghosts, the routes that once mattered but don't anymore. Highways are fickle creatures. A single rerouting can change the fate of an entire town. When a bypass opens to ease congestion, the main street that once funneled travellers and trade is suddenly irrelevant. The petrol station sells its last few litres, the diner closes early, and the motel's vacancy sign stays permanently lit. It's a paradox of progress. By trying to move traffic more efficiently, we often move prosperity elsewhere. You can still trace these forgotten arteries on satellite images. Graceful old highways now running parallel to sleek new motorways, winding past quiet motels and crumbling billboards. Economists call this spatial substitution. Geographers see it as proof that access is a currency of its own. When a route loses flow, it loses value. Railways tell the same story in iron and rust. Many once thriving towns grew around their stations, the proud platforms, the rhythm of arrivals and departures, the smell of coal and oil. Then slowly the schedules thinned. Lines closed, or worse, changed gauge, making once connected depots useless. Entire regions in Europe and Asia still bear the marks of incompatible track widths, relics of old empires that wanted their trains, but not their neighbours, to cross borders. The results are curious. Stations marooned in countryside, rails gleaming into nowhere. The infrastructure remains even when the purpose that justified it is gone. In some places, those old tracks find new life as cycle paths or walking trails, but many simply lie still, a linear archaeology of progress, rusting gently under weeds. The echoes of the timetable remain visible in how towns are arranged. The station road, the goods yard, the row of worker cottages still neatly lined up beside a silence that once roared with steam. Ports, too, reveal the geography of abandonment. For centuries, coastal cities grew fat on maritime trade, their docks thronged with ships and warehouses stacked with goods. But when containerization arrived in the mid-20th century, it rewrote the logic of the sea. Instead of small ships needing many ports, giant vessels needed only a few deep-water harbours with specialised cranes. It was efficient, spectacularly so, but ruthless. Entire waterfront districts became obsolete almost overnight. Old docks too shallow for container ships fell into stillness. Warehouses turned into echo chambers where seagulls nested. Some ports reinvented themselves as cultural quarters or marinas, but many simply withered, bypassed by trade in the same way small towns are bypassed by motorways. A handful of deep harbours, Singapore, Rotterdam, Shanghai, now handle much of the world's shipping, while hundreds of once busy wharves sit quietly watching the tide. Even utilities, those invisible veins of a settlement, tell a story when people vanish. Electricity and water systems record population change far earlier than censuses do. Power grids notice the absence before anyone else does. Substations hum steadily, but the load drops. The current that once fed hundreds of homes now feeds only dozens. Engineers see it in the data, voltage stability improving, demand curves flattening, transformers idling more often. It's eerie. The machinery is still perfect, but the need for it has thinned. Water systems face the opposite problem. When flow slows down, pipes corrode faster, and reservoirs stagnate. Towns that lose people must re-engineer their own arteries simply to prevent decay. Some utilities downsize, others consolidate, pumping water from a larger neighbouring grid rather than maintaining a skeleton network. Infrastructure, like any organism, prefers movement. When movement stops, the the system begins to fail in strange ways. Air pockets, bacteria, rust, silence. Consider a small river town built for freight, its warehouses hugging the bank. For generations, barges carried grain and coal through its heart, until one day a new bridge was built upstream. It was more modern, with better clearance for trucks and deeper water for ships. Freight companies rerouted, and the town's economic current shifted without warning. Within a few years, the docks were quiet, the cranes unmoving. The bridge didn't destroy the town, it simply diverted the logic that sustained it. Geography rewards convenience, not sentiment. If you walk through such places today, you can sense the presence of this quiet machinery. A railway signal still flashes red for trains that never come. Streetlights turn on automatically each evening, serving no one but the wind. Power lines cross fields where no one lives, connecting substations that hum to themselves. The world hums with faint residual energy, the sound of systems built to serve a larger past. Urban historians sometimes describe infrastructure as sticky. Once it's built, it stays, even when people don't. Tearing up roads or rails is expensive. It's often easier to let them decay in place. That's why abandoned grids still lace the countryside, why ghost suburbs show perfect geometry from above, why forgotten industrial parks still have immaculate roundabouts leading to nowhere. The physical map outlives the social one, yet there's a quiet beauty in this endurance. Long after the population has fallen, the infrastructure remains as a kind of fossil record of ambition. It tells future archaeologists how people once organised space, how technology shaped their priorities, and how quickly a network can lose its users. A power pylon in an empty field is as eloquent as a ruined temple. Both monuments to the idea that permanence could be built from metal and willpower. If you listen closely, every silent town has a mechanical undertone. The distant buzz of a transformer, the ticking of a cooling pipe, the low throb of a generator powering empty streets. That soft hum is the ghost of a community's metabolism, a rhythm still pulsing long after the people have gone. Infrastructure doesn't mourn or celebrate, it simply endures. And in doing so, it becomes the truest archaeologist of all, preserving not just where people lived, but how they connected, moved, and dreamed of staying forever. Every city depends on something: trade, climate, culture, or connection. But some towns depend on a single thing, and when that thing runs out, the place itself begins to unravel. Company towns are some of the most vivid examples of geography and economics intertwining so tightly that when one slips, both fall together. They rise quickly, burn brightly, and often fade in eerie synchrony with the resource that birthed them. The pattern is ancient but universal. First comes discovery, a seam of coal, a vein of gold, an oil field glistening beneath the sand. Then comes the rush, surveyors, investors, engineers, and the wave of workers who follow. Temporary camps turn into settlements, and settlements into towns. Streets form around the shaft, the mill or the refinery. Schools, hospitals, and theatres appear almost overnight, funded by the company's deep pockets and the optimism of permanence. For a while, everything hums in balance: the earth below, the payroll above, and the constant rhythm of extraction tying them together. But the rhythm can stop abruptly. In mining towns, the relationship between geology and economy is brutally direct. When ore grades fall, meaning there's less valuable material per ton of rock, the costs of extraction climb while profits sink. It's the geological equivalent of running out of breath. When prices tumble on the global market, mines shut even if they're half full. Geography decides where the resource lies. Economics decides whether it's worth taking. The result is the same either way: silence where machines once thundered. In the coal towns of Appalachia, the story is written in steep valleys and black dust. For over a century, coal was both livelihood and identity. Entire families worked the mines, their lives measured by the whistle that marked each shift. But as demand changed and automation advanced, the mines closed one by one. The distance to replacement jobs proved insurmountable, often hundreds of kilometres to the nearest city, over winding mountain roads. Geography magnified the isolation. Without alternative industries nearby, populations dwindled, houses emptied, and schools merged until only a few remained. The landscape still glows faintly at night from methane vents, a reminder that what once powered the world still smoulders beneath the surface. Across the Pacific, Japan's Hashima Island offers a striking, compact version of the same cycle. Nicknamed Battleship Island for its shape, it was one of the most densely populated places on Earth during its peak in the mid-20th century. Coal mining built it, an entire concrete city constructed atop a rocky outcrop off Nagasaki's coast. The company owned everything: the apartments, the shop, the school, even the cinema. Life was efficient but enclosed, a floating machine of human labour. Then, in the 1970s, oil replaced coal as Japan's primary energy source. Within months, the island was evacuated. Today, its buildings still stand, roofs collapsing inward, walls streaked with salt spray, a frozen image of industrial ambition left to the waves. High in the Andes, at altitudes where the air itself feels thin, mining settlements cling to cliffsides in pursuit of copper, silver and gold. These communities face not only economic volatility but physical extremity. Winters are long, oxygen scarce, and every supply must travel along perilous switchback roads. When global prices dip, the companies pull out, leaving behind machinery, tailing ponds, and skeletons of dormitories. The altitude that once guarded the treasure now isolates the remains. Unlike coastal cities or fertile plains, these high-altitude camps rarely attract new uses. The geography that gave them riches also seals their fate. Oil and gas towns follow a faster rhythm, a kind of economic sprint. When a field is discovered, small settlements explode in size. Prefabricated housing arrives by the hundreds, and populations double almost overnight. Cafes, laundromats and clinics spring up to serve the influx of workers. But the infrastructure often remains temporary, built with the same lifespan as the boom itself. When production peaks or prices crash, the exodus is swift. Parking lots full one week are empty the next. In parts of Texas, Alberta and Siberia, ghost neighbourhoods stand as reminders of this volatile cycle. The architecture of optimism replaced by silence in the space of a season. Even the sea has its version of the company town. Logging ports and fishing harbours thrive on resource abundance and favourable policy, both of which can vanish quickly. A changing quota, a collapse in fish stocks, or a shift in ocean temperature can turn a prosperous dock into a museum of ropes and rust. Once the fleets move to deeper or colder waters, the piers fall still. Timber towns fare no better when new conservation laws or depleted forests halt their trade. The geography that once promised endless bounty proves finite after all. The collapse of these towns leaves not only economic scars but environmental ones. Mines leave open pits, tailings laced with heavy metals, and rivers turned acidic. Oil fields leak and flare, their pipes too costly to dismantle. Logging scars take generations to heal. Remediation, the slow, careful restoration of land, can take decades. Geography sets the timetable. Vegetation grows faster in humid tropics than in dry steppe, and contaminated soils leach more slowly in cold climates. Some places recover within a lifetime, others may never fully return to what they were, and then there's the human timeline. shorter but just as enduring. Former miners and drillers often remain near the places that shape them, bound by familiarity even as jobs vanish. They become the living historians of landscapes in transition, their memories mapping what the terrain can no longer show. The rusted conveyor belt becomes a landmark, the old loading dock a story told to visiting grandchildren. Even in decline, these towns retain a strange kind of gravity, holding on to the people who remember what they once were. In the end, company towns and extraction landscapes reveal one of geography's hardest truths. A settlement's fate is only as durable as the resource beneath it. Once that resource is gone, distance, cost and terrain conspire to keep revival out of reach. Yet there's a quiet dignity in the ruins, the skeletal cranes, the silent shafts, the wind whispering through open doors. They stand as reminders that prosperity can be as temporary as the seam it sits on, and that the earth, patient as ever, always takes back what was borrowed. When a city builds its identity around the rhythm of machines, it hums with purpose until the day the hum stops. Industrial cities are landscapes of momentum, made for motion and noise, and when that motion ends, silence feels especially loud. The story of deindustrialization isn't only about economics, it's about geography, about how shifting connections between people, products and places can drain life from the very ground that once sparked it. Detroit might be the most famous example, a city where an industry and an identity were once the same word. For much of the 20th century, Detroit was the beating heart of the automotive world, a place where assembly lines ran like arteries, pumping out cars by the minute and prosperity by the mile. At its peak, over 1.5 million people lived there, drawn by steady wages and the promise of upward mobility. Whole neighbourhoods grew up around the factory gates, and every house seemed to have a driveway proudly filled with what its residents built. But industrial geography, like the cars themselves, depends on movement. As highways stretched farther into the suburbs, land grew cheaper beyond the city limits. Factories followed the roads, and workers followed the factories. Employment began to disperse, scattering like bolts rolling off a workbench. Car dependency reshaped the map. Once compact communities stretched outward, making the very density that had powered the city feel unnecessary. When manufacturing jobs left for newer plants in the Sun Belt or overseas, Detroit's core was left hollowed. The infrastructure remained, the wide boulevards, the silent rail lines, the grand but empty office towers, a monument to a time when geography and economy were perfectly aligned. From the air, you can still trace the story in light. Satellite images show how Detroit's night glow dimmed decade by decade, not in a single collapse, but in concentric fading rings. The suburbs shimmer brighter now, while the centre glows like a quiet ember. Land cover change maps confirm the shift. Pavement giving way to grass, old lots sprouting with trees, brownfields transforming into accidental green corridors. The city didn't vanish, it simply changed texture, exchanging steel and smoke for soil and sunlight. Across the Atlantic, northern England tells a similar story in a different accent. For over a century, towns like Sheffield, Sunderland and Newcastle were synonymous with steel, shipbuilding and coal. Geography made them ideal, close to rivers, coal seams and ports. Whole regions were designed around freight patterns, with rails feeding mills and docks feeding the world. But when those patterns changed, when rail gave way to road and road to container shipping, the old logic fractured. Containerization once again proved both miracle and menace. Huge standardized boxes revolutionized trade, but they required deep water ports and vast flat land for cranes and storage. The older docks, often nestled in narrow estuaries or surrounded by dense housing, simply couldn't compete. As shipping consolidated into fewer, larger terminals, cities like Liverpool and Sunderland lost their maritime pulse. Rail yards rusted, warehouses stood half empty, and cranes froze in place mid-gesture. Industrial heartlands found themselves stranded inland, their connections severed not by distance, but by obsolescence. Yet even decline reshapes the map in creative ways. In the former still towns of Yorkshire, old rail lines have been reborn as cycling trails. In Newcastle, shipyards have turned into cultural waterfronts, where music festivals echo off the same walls that once built ocean liners. Geography, stubborn as ever, finds new equilibrium. The same river that once launched ships now powers hydroelectric lights strung over cafes. In Germany's Ruhr Valley, once a maze of coal mines and steel plants, a different story unfolded, one of transformation by design. For decades, the Ruhr was the industrial core of Europe, a region where smoke was synonymous with success. Cities like Essen and Dortmund grew so close that they blurred into one continuous metropolis, each neighbourhood anchored by a mine or a mill. When the industry began to falter in the late 20th century, the area faced an existential question. What do you do with a landscape built entirely around extraction and production? Instead of erasing its industrial past, the Ruhr repurposed it. Coal plants became museums, gasometers became art spaces, and slag heaps became panoramic parks. A network of greenways now connects these sites, cycling paths and footbridges laid along old rail corridors. From above, the region looks like a living diagram of adaptation, where every former wound has been turned into a new artery. Economically, the Ruhr shifted towards services, education and technology, but physically it retained its memory. The geography of labour became a geography of leisure. This kind of regeneration isn't simple or quick. Brownfield land, old industrial ground, takes decades to heal. Soil must be remediated, rivers cleansed, and structural remnants stabilised. But those same sites offer advantages. They're already connected, already mapped, and already familiar. They become blank pages in the middle of the book. Many European and American cities now use satellite and drone data to guide this renewal, measuring vegetation growth on derelict land and tracking nightlight intensity as a proxy for recovery. It's geography as therapy, one data point at a time. Industrial decline doesn't erase human ingenuity, it redirects it. The skills that once built engines or smelted iron don't disappear, they migrate into new forms. In Detroit, artisans now craft furniture and sculptures from the reclaimed wood and metal of fallen factories. In Sheffield, the tradition of steel lives on in precision engineering and high-tech alloys. In the Ruhr, the coal pits that once powered the continent now house startups and film studios. The transformation is literal and symbolic, turning darkness into light, rust into growth. Yet the emotional geography remains complicated. For those who lived through the boom years, a silent factory is not just a building. It's a memory of certainty, of identity, of collective pride. When those spaces are converted into parks or galleries, it can feel like a victory tinged with loss. The sound of progress changes pitch, but it never entirely fades. From above, the patterns are unmistakable. Bright zones of industry dim, while green patches bloom where rail yards once sprawled. Economists call this the service transition. Geographers, perhaps more poetically, call it succession, the same term ecologists use when a forest grows over a field. Cities like ecosystems reclaim what's left behind. The old engines have cooled, but the landscapes they shaped are still in motion. Only now the rhythm is slower, more deliberate. Where once there were furnaces and freight cars, there are parks, studios and skylines reflected in quiet rivers. Industrial power may have turned to rust, but in that rust lies the seed of renewal. proof that even in stillness, geography keeps evolving, endlessly patient, endlessly inventive. Some ghost cities are not shaped by time or economics, but by catastrophe, the sudden moments when geography itself turns against its inhabitants. These are the places that were not slowly emptied, but swiftly erased, where maps were redrawn by radiation, ash, water, or earth. And yet, even in such stillness, life finds its way back. Disaster, in its strange geography, creates new kinds of landscapes, restricted, reclaimed, and sometimes hauntingly alive. Pripyat is perhaps the clearest image of that transformation, a city that vanished in a single day. Built in the 1970s in what is now northern Ukraine, it was a model of Soviet modernity, a showcase for the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. There were schools, swimming pools, a cinema, and even a fairground waiting for its first visitors. But on the morning of April 26, 1986, that world ended with a single explosion from Reactor 4. Within hours, an invisible geography took over, one mapped not by streets, but by radiation. The evacuation order came too late for many, but was swift once it began. Buses lined the streets, their doors open, engines idling. Families left food on tables and washing on the line, believing they would return in a few days. None did. In the decades since, the Chernobyl exclusion zone, an area of roughly 30 kilometers radius, has become a paradoxical wilderness. The concrete blocks and Ferris wheels remain frozen in time, yet the forests have crept back in, thick and green. Wolves, deer, boar, and even bears roam through what was once a playground of industry. Scientists now study this zone as an unintended nature reserve, a living experiment in how ecosystems respond when humans suddenly vanish. The radiation remains invisible but measurable, shaping the land's recovery for centuries to come. Other disasters leave different signatures. In southern Italy, near the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, lies Pompeii, the most famous city ever buried alive. When the volcano erupted in 79 CE, ash and pumice rained down for hours, smothering the streets, sealing roofs, and freezing daily life mid-motion. Unlike Pripyat, Pompeii's tragedy preserved rather than erased. It became a time capsule of Roman urban life, mosaic still bright, bread still in the oven, even graffiti still legible on the walls. For archaeologists and geographers alike, Pompeii offers an unparalleled record of how a city functioned. Its road layout, water systems and social spaces all suspended beneath volcanic ash. Volcanic disasters shape land in ways both violent and creative. Lava buries towns, yes, but it also creates new ground. The island of Heimaey in Iceland famously grew larger after a 1973 eruption. The town's harbour was nearly lost until residents sprayed seawater onto advancing lava to divert its path, a human act of defiance against geology itself. Elsewhere, such intervention isn't possible. The towns at the foot of Mount Mayon in the Philippines, or those along Hawaii's Kilauea, have learned to rebuild again and again on freshly cooled basalt. Geography here is cyclical. Destruction, creation, destruction again. Earthquakes, by contrast, don't build new land. They simply rearrange what already exists. When fault lines shift, they leave both physical scars and administrative ones. After major quakes, governments often declare red zones, areas too unstable to rebuild. These are not ruins so much as quarantined landscapes, fenced off from memory and risk alike. Christchurch, New Zealand, experienced this after its 2011 quake. Entire neighbourhoods near the Avon River were deemed unsafe due to liquefaction, the ground itself behaving like a liquid during shaking. Rather than rebuild, authorities bought the properties, removed the remnants, and let the land return to meadow and wetland. This process has a name that is quietly reshaping modern geography: managed retreat. Instead of fighting the forces of nature indefinitely, managed retreat accepts that certain areas are better yielded than defended. It is an idea both pragmatic and profoundly emotional. People have always battled floods, storms, and shifting coastlines with dikes and levees, but as sea levels rise and extreme weather intensifies, the cost of holding ground grows steeper. Managed retreat isn't surrender, it's strategy. Moving people, infrastructure, and memory to safer elevations, allowing the landscape to breathe again. In parts of the United States, neighborhoods along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers have gone through this process. Residents accept government buyouts, homes are demolished, and streets are removed from official maps. What's left is open space, sometimes restored to forest or grassland, sometimes left as wetlands to absorb future floods. The change is invisible to outsiders, but to those who lived there, the absence itself is monumental. A front porch becomes a meadow. A road ends in grass. Geography doesn't erase, it heals at its own pace. The idea extends to coastlines too. In the Netherlands, long famous for its defiance of the sea, engineers now design room for the river projects. Deliberate flood zones where water can safely expand without threatening towns. These buffer zones transform disaster into design. Rather than build higher walls, planners lower certain lands, letting geography share the load. The concept is quietly radical, admitting that control is temporary and coexistence more sustainable than conquest. When you step back and look at a map of these disaster-shaped regions, a strange beauty emerges. The red zones, the exclusion areas, the reclaimed wetlands, they form a kind of negative geography, a cartography of absence. Each blank space tells a story of what once was and what might return in another form. The edges of these areas are often the most dynamic, zones where scientists, conservationists, and sometimes even tourists step gingerly between danger and rebirth. In the Chernobyl forests, trees grow through cracked roofs, and moose wander past rusting Ferris wheels. In Pompeii, wildflowers bloom between Roman paving stones. In Christchurch, birds now nest where living rooms once stood. Disaster doesn't just destroy, it rearranges. It shifts the balance between human ambition and natural process, reminding us that maps are temporary agreements with the earth. These are the cities drawn off the map, not because cartographers forgot them, but because the land itself asked for a pause. Whether through fire, water, or radiation, each tells a quiet truth about impermanence. Geography is never still. The earth moves, the seas rise, and every so often a place built for living becomes a place for remembering. And as always, once people step back, life, in all its stubborn green insistence, steps in. Some cities are silenced not by nature or economics, but by politics. The thin lines on maps that can stop time itself. Borders have the peculiar ability to freeze geography, to take ordinary streets and turn them into symbols, and sometimes into no man's land. When conflict halts abruptly, the land holds its breath, and entire towns find themselves trapped in that pause, half alive and half remembered. Nowhere shows this more hauntingly than Varosha, the seaside quarter of Famagusta in Cyprus. In the early 1970s, it was the jewel of the Mediterranean, a glamorous resort town visited by film stars and honeymooners, its hotels glittering along golden sand. Then, in 1974, political tensions between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots erupted into invasion and division. When Turkish forces advanced, the residents of Varosha fled south, expecting to return once the fighting stopped. But the ceasefire line that followed didn't retreat. It solidified, a barbed wire border slicing through the island, leaving Varosha sealed inside a military zone. For nearly half a century its skyline has stood untouched, trapped in perpetual summer. Curtains flutter behind broken windows, hotel lobbies are filled with sand, and palm trees grow through empty swimming pools. The beach, once ranked among Europe's finest, is now off limits, guarded by fences and silence. In Varosha, the geography of tourism became a geography of stasis. A ceasefire, by design, freezes violence, but it also freezes place. Urban time stopped in 1974 and has barely moved since. The phenomenon isn't unique. Around the world, demilitarized zones and buffer areas have carved strange absences into the map. The Korean demilitarized zone, stretching roughly 4 kilometers wide, is one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. Yet within that ribbon of restricted land, wildlife flourishes. Cranes, bears, and rare plants, reclaiming a corridor untouched by farming or construction for decades. The irony is striking. The most peaceful ecosystem on the peninsula exists precisely because people are forbidden to enter. Geography, it seems, can turn tragedy into refuge, given enough time and silence. These buffer areas don't just erase towns, they also rearrange everything around them. When a road is cut by a border, the settlements at either end lose their purpose. Trade stalls vanish, bus routes terminate abruptly, and villages once 10 minutes apart by tractor must now drive hours around checkpoints. Agricultural patterns fracture too. Fields divided by fences go untended, irrigation canals stop at wire, and what was once a shared valley becomes 2 landscapes staring at each other across an invisible divide. The soil doesn't care about politics, but crops need continuity, and war interrupts even the most ancient rhythms of planting and harvest. In the divided city of Nicosia, the capital of Cyprus, that interruption is visible in miniature. Streets that once ran seamlessly from north to south now dead-end against sandbagged barricades. Storefronts are frozen mid-century, their signs fading in the sun. Yet on both sides, life has adapted. New markets, new roads, new centres of gravity are formed, while the old core sleeps. Borders don't just stop movement, they redirect it. Over time, new peripheries emerge like rings around an injury, reshaping urban geography to skirt the wound. Even far from front lines, the shadow of conflict alters the way cities breathe. Checkpoints and restricted access zones have a gravitational pull. They attract watchtowers, administrative offices, and whole economies of paperwork and waiting. For locals, the landscape becomes a maze of conditional spaces, where one road is safe today but not tomorrow, where one field can be harvested but not fenced. Insurance becomes impossible to obtain, investment dries up, and buildings decay, not because they were destroyed, but because they can no longer be maintained. A single line on a map can turn an entire neighbourhood into a no-go zone. In some regions, these invisible frontiers even outlast the reasons for their creation. The Green Line in Cyprus, originally meant as a temporary buffer, has become a de facto ecosystem of stillness. Similarly, in parts of the Balkans, the ghostly remains of checkpoints and custom posts linger years after borders have softened. Concrete barriers crumble slowly beside reopened roads, reminders that political geography moves slower than human optimism. The effects ripple outward in surprising ways. When a community becomes isolated by border shifts, its youth often leave for better opportunities elsewhere. The population ages, and the economic base erodes. Villages that once thrived on cross-border markets, a cheese sold here, a fabric bought there, now sit quiet, their shops permanently shuttered. The term peripheralization describes this process, how edges created by policy become centres of decline. Maps simplify it to a line, but on the ground it's a gradient of fading vitality. For geographers, these places are laboratories of stasis. They reveal what happens when movement, the lifeblood of settlement, is interrupted indefinitely. Satellite imagery shows it vividly. Night lights, bright on one side, dim on the other, a precise glowing scar visible from orbit. Land cover data traces the spread of vegetation into once built areas, the slow conversion of asphalt to grass. You can measure the passing of years not by construction but by decay. Yet even here, renewal finds footholds. In recent years, parts of Varosha have been tentatively reopened under political negotiation, though controversy surrounds each step. Tourists can walk a few streets again, peering into hushed hotels where calendars still read 1974. Some hope the area might one day be restored. Others prefer it remain a memorial, an open-air museum of interrupted lives. Either way, it stands as one of the clearest examples of how borders can hold time captive. There's an odd calm to these frozen geographies. Nature, indifferent to ideology, reclaims the edges while humans debate ownership. Wildflowers bloom beside warning signs. Birds perch on barbed wire. The very act of exclusion has created unintended sanctuaries. From space they appear as green ribbons amid grey. Proof that even in division, the planet finds continuity. Conflict leaves visible scars, but also creates strange pockets of peace. These towns and corridors remind us that geography is never just about land, it's about connection. Cut those connections, and even the most vibrant city can fall still. Varosha, Nicosia, and the countless unnamed villages along forgotten ceasefire lines all teach the same quiet lesson. When borders stop people, time stops with them. And yet, just beyond the fences, grass keeps growing, rivers keep flowing, and the earth continues its patient work of erasing every line ever drawn. Every age has tried to build its own version of a perfect city, a place of symmetry, foresight, and optimism, drawn more neatly on the blueprint than it ever appears in life. Planned cities are humanity's recurring dream of control over chaos, a belief that with enough order, we can design our way to harmony. Yet sometimes the dream arrives before the people do. Across the world, vast districts rise in glass and marble, their parks trimmed, their lights glowing, but their echoes louder than their footsteps. These are not ruins, but places still waiting for their stories to begin. Take the wide boulevards of Ordos Kangbashi in Inner Mongolia. In the early 2000s, it was built to be a monument to prosperity. An entire city conjured from the desert, designed to house hundreds of thousands of people. The architecture was bold, sweeping plazas, colossal sculptures, and government buildings gleaming in the dry northern sun. For years, though, the street stayed eerily quiet. Journalists labelled it a ghost city, the symbol of overbuilding. But the truth, as always, is slower and more layered. Ordos was not empty because people vanished. It was quiet because they hadn't yet arrived. Over time, residents have trickled in. Schools opened, new jobs followed, and the city began to settle into the role it was meant to play. What looked like failure was, in part, geography lagging behind ambition. 1,000 kilometers southeast, Tianducheng in Zhejiang province took a different path to stillness. It's famous for its miniature Eiffel Tower and Parisian-style boulevards, a surreal slice of Europe recreated in China's countryside. Built in the early 2000s as an upscale residential development, it initially attracted more cameras than residents. The villas sold, but many stayed dark. The issue wasn't lack of beauty, it was a mismatch of purpose. There were more apartments than jobs, more fountains than factories. Without a strong local economy to anchor it, the Paris of the East drifted into quietness. But as nearby Hangzhou expanded, Tianducheng began to fill. Subways reached it, schools opened, and people started to move in for the same reason cities have always grown: convenience. The fantasy became livable. This pattern, the slow blooming of planned utopias repeats across continents. From Brasilia's monumental avenues to Egypt's new administrative capital rising in the desert, planners have long imagined that if you build the city, the citizens will come. Sometimes they do, but only when the invisible threads of geography align. Transport links, employment centres, and administrative decisions. A city, no matter how elegant, cannot thrive on architecture alone. The mechanics behind these ambitious projects often lie in finance rather than philosophy. In rapidly urbanising countries, local governments rely on land finance, selling development rights, or leasing land to fund public budgets. Building large districts generates immediate revenue, even if residents take years to arrive. Investors, too, are drawn to property as a stable store of wealth. Apartments become assets before they become homes. This speculative ecosystem can produce cities that are fully constructed but only half lived in. Urban theatres awaiting an audience. Policy adds another layer of complexity. In China, the household registration system known as hukou historically linked social benefits, like schooling and healthcare, to one's home region. Migrants moving for work could not easily relocate their official status, making them hesitant to settle permanently in new districts. So, while millions found jobs in expanding industrial zones, many preferred to rent temporary housing near workplaces rather than buy in distant, pristine suburbs. The result? Freshly painted neighbourhoods where the lights at night didn't match the number of apartments built. The pattern is not unique to China. Planned capitals often face similar growing pains. Brasilia, inaugurated in 1960, was designed as a modernist vision of order in the middle of Brazil's savannah. Its monumental axis, shaped like an airplane, was meant to symbolise flight into the future. Yet in its early years, the wings felt empty. The city's administrative functions arrived long before its social fabric. Only later, as surrounding satellite towns developed, did Brasilia find its rhythm. A city that still fascinates geographers as both masterpiece and maze. Indicators of slow occupancy can be subtle but measurable. School enrollment figures reveal how many families have truly moved in. A district may have 10,000 apartments, but only a few hundred students. Retail tenancy rates tell a similar story. How many of those sleek storefronts are open versus shuttered? These clues, drawn from everyday data, reveal the living pulse of a city better than any official speech or skyline photograph. Nighttime satellite images offer another metric. In a thriving district, the lights spread organically, following roads and parks. In an under-occupied one, they cluster in pockets, islands of brightness adrift in planned geometry. There's an emotional geography to these places too. Walking through them feels like stepping into the future on a quiet day. The air is clean, the pavement immaculate, and the streetlights obediently glow each evening even if no one passes beneath them. Urbanists sometimes call this anticipatory space, infrastructure built ahead of demand, a kind of optimism cast in concrete. It's both eerie and hopeful, a testament to faith in growth. The challenge lies in balance. Build too slowly and cities choke on overcrowded cores. Build too quickly and resources stretch thin while streets wait for people. Geography mediates this dance. Distance to jobs, climate comfort, and the web of transport routes determine how fast a place can fill. A new city might have all the amenities in theory, but if it's 40 kilometres from the nearest workplace and lacks fast trains, its plazas will echo until someone fixes that link. Yet patience often proves the best urban planner of all. Many so-called ghost cities have grown steadily into functional communities once connectivity improves and economies mature. Ordos, Tianducheng and several new capitals are now far from lifeless. Their once empty towers house families, their parks bustle with joggers and children. geography simply needed time to catch up with imagination. Planned utopias are reminders that cities are less about what we build and more about how we inhabit. A perfect grid means little without laughter, noise, and argument, the small, untidy ingredients of life. The early emptiness of these places isn't necessarily failure, it's the echo before the music starts. Given time, people bring rhythm to geometry, and what was once labelled a ghost can become, quite simply, home. Water is the most persuasive architect on Earth. It carves canyons, builds deltas, and quietly rearranges human ambition. For thousands of years, people have followed rivers and lakes, trusting them as reliable partners. Yet those same waters are restless. They flood, they retreat, they rise behind dams and vanish into drought. Cities in turn must learn to move with them, to shift their foundations and memories as the landscape changes. All across the world there are towns that sleep beneath water. They were not destroyed by disaster but by design. When great dams were built in the 20th century, entire valleys were sacrificed for the sake of energy and irrigation. Reservoirs swallowed villages, churches, and orchards, their outlines preserved beneath the surface like stories under glass. On calm days, boaters can sometimes glimpse the tops of old walls below, blurred by silt and time. One of the most striking examples lies beneath Spain's Belisar Reservoir. When it filled in the 1960s, it drowned several Galician hamlets along the Minho River. For decades, only the surface shimmered. But in times of drought, the water recedes and the ruins reappear. A ghostly resurrection of stone bridges, stairways, and the skeletal tower of a church rising into the sunlight. Similar sights have appeared across Europe in recent years as reservoirs shrink under persistent heat. Italy's Lake Resia famously reveals its church steeple each summer, a single finger of stone pointing upward through turquoise water. What was once tragedy has become a kind of landmark, a reminder that even water forgets where it was meant to stay. Elsewhere, whole landscapes are being reshaped not by sudden flooding, but by slow exhaustion. Deltas, those rich, fertile fans of river sediment, are among the most productive places on the planet, but they are also among the most fragile. Cities like New Orleans, Bangkok, and Dhaka rest on ground that is literally sinking. Decades of levees, canals, and groundwater extraction have caused subsidence, where the land settles as the water table drops. Add sea level rise and the equation grows dire. As saltwater pushes inland, farmlands that once grew rice or wheat begin to taste the sea. Salinization poisons soil and corrodes infrastructure. Wells that once yielded fresh water turn brackish. The geography of habitability shifts metre by metre each year, forcing communities to migrate inland or upward. Farmers adapt where they can, switching to salt-tolerant crops, raising embankments or turning to aquaculture. But the trend is relentless. Nature's map is redrawing itself in gradients of salt. Even where land remains above water, rivers themselves have a habit of changing their minds. Realignment projects, where engineers cut new channels or divert flow for flood control, can leave old ports and towns suddenly stranded far from the water they depended on. A wharf that once stood at the heart of commerce might find itself overlooking a meadow. In the United States, the Mississippi's restless loops have repeatedly abandoned towns to dry land, leaving cut-off lakes in their wake. In China, the Yellow River has altered its course so many times that it's called China's Sorrow, its shifts recorded like eras in a family chronicle. Each time, communities had to adapt, moving their fields, their roads, and sometimes their entire identities. Irrigation, too, creates new geographies. When massive canal networks are built, they reorder the logic of settlement. Villages that once clung to riverbanks drift down canal, following the flow of water that now determines fertility. In parts of Pakistan's Indus Basin, 19th century canal projects birthed entire towns in what was once arid scrubland. Yet the same canals that gave life also demanded obedience. When the flow reduced or silted, prosperity retreated. You can trace these hydraulic geographies on modern maps, lines of green running like handwriting across brown plains, each bend marking the path of a canal and the pattern of human movement it inspires. The paradox of dams and diversions is that they bring both stability and impermanence. They promise control, flood prevention, power, irrigation, yet they also guarantee transformation. Reservoirs alter local climates, replacing morning frost with mist. They submerge the past while creating new shorelines that quickly acquire their own histories. Fishermen cast nets above what were once streets. Children play on the banks of artificial lakes, unaware that entire generations once lived where they now swim. Geography, ever patient, layers these stories without judgment. From space, the transformation is easy to see. Satellite images taken years apart show rippling blue areas expanding and contracting like lungs. A pre-dam map might display a narrow river. The post-dam version reveals a vast irregular lake edged by pale soil, the mark of water level change. During dry years, the surface shrinks dramatically, exposing patterns of terraces, roads, and even the outlines of villages. These shifts are measurable in pixels, but they carry the weight of human displacement and environmental change far beyond their scale. Drought is the quiet sculptor of this story. As climates warm, rainfall becomes less predictable, and regions built around reliable rivers face new uncertainty. In North America's southwest, lakes like Mead and Powell, once symbols of triumph over the desert, have receded to record lows. The so-called bathtub rings of pale mineral along their shores mark the years of loss like growth rings in reverse. Ghost towns that were once evacuated for rising waters now resurface as the drought deepens. Cemeteries, roads, and foundations reappear, only to vanish again when the rains return. Time, in these places, moves with the tide of water storage. The human response to these changing waters is as varied as the geography itself. Some towns relocate uphill, preserving their name but not their site. Others rebuild around tourism, turning lakeside vistas into attractions. Still others fade completely, their existence remembered only in maps, church records, and the occasional surfacing spire. The challenge for modern planners is not just to manage water, but to anticipate its next move, to design cities flexible enough to drift with it rather than resist. Because water, unlike stone or soil, never truly settles. It is a traveller, endlessly negotiating between gravity and evaporation. It rewards cooperation and punishes certainty. Every time humans draw a line to contain it, it eventually redraws the line elsewhere. Cities have learned, often the hard way, that survival lies in partnership rather than mastery. Reservoirs will rise and fall, deltas will breathe in and out with the tide, and rivers will continue their slow, looping arguments with the land. In the end, it's not the drowned steeples or exposed riverbeds that define this geography. It's the rhythm. Water moves, and so must we. Every shoreline is temporary, every map provisional, every city a guest at the table of the Earth's most persuasive element. Tourism creates cities that breathe in and out with the seasons. In summer, they pulse with colour, sound and motion. Ice cream stalls, parasols and laughter bouncing off sunlit walls. But when the season ends, the air changes. Shutters close, pavements glisten with rain, and the sound of waves replaces the hum of conversation. These are towns caught in a perpetual cycle of arrival and departure, swelling with strangers one month and exhaling them the next. Seasonal resort towns occupy a curious middle ground between life and absence. They are not truly abandoned, but they know how to impersonate it perfectly. In the Mediterranean, the contrast can feel dramatic. Beaches teeming with sunbathers in July turn into lonely stretches of wind-blown sand by November. The shop fronts that once advertised diving tours or gelato shut tight, their colours faded under salt and spray. Even the street cats seem fewer. But if you look closely, you'll find signs of quiet continuity. A bakery that still opens each morning, a fisherman patching nets, a caretaker sweeping sand out of doorways. The geography of tourism is not about permanence, it's about rhythm. Economists sometimes describe these patterns through occupancy rates or employment figures, but for locals, it's more visceral than numerical. In places like the Amalfi Coast, Spain's Costa Brava, or the Croatian islands, population can multiply fivefold in summer. Then, just as suddenly it ebbs away, leaving infrastructure that feels oversized, hotels half lit, buses half full, and streets designed for crowds now echoing with footsteps. Schools, interestingly, tell the truer story. Enrollment rarely changes much. Children remain constant even when visitors do not. A town that empties by the calendar but fills again the next year is healthy in its own seasonal way. Cyclical emptiness, after all, is not the same as decline. In many coastal regions, the economy and the ecosystem are built on repetition. Temporary stillness is part of the design, like a field left fallow to recover. Businesses plan for the off-season, staff migrate to other resorts, hotels close for refurbishment, and beaches undergo their annual clean. But structural decline feels different. It's when the cycle fails to return, when a resort's quiet months stretch into quiet years. The difference can be measured not in tourist numbers, but in confidence. Do new restaurants still open each spring? Are schools keeping pace with families staying year-round? These subtle indicators reveal whether a place is resting or fading. Some coastal resorts find the distinction hard to maintain because their geography itself is shifting. The ocean, endlessly patient, keeps redrawing the shoreline. In parts of England's east coast, promenades that once framed the sea now sit several metres inland, the waves having eaten the sand beneath their feet. Beachfront hotels that boasted ocean views forever have found themselves precariously close to the edge. Erosion doesn't just consume land, it erases logic. Streets lose their destination, car parks turn to cliffs, and boardwalks end abruptly in air. In low-lying deltas and atoll islands, the threat is subtler but no less serious. Sea level rise and storm surges make rebuilding difficult. For every new seawall constructed, another metre of beach disappears somewhere else. The economics of defence often determine who can afford to stay. Wealthier resorts fortify, smaller ones surrender to retreat. It's a quiet geography of inequality written in tides and property values. At the opposite end of the thermometer, mountain towns face their own seasonality. Ski resorts depend on snow like coral reefs, depend on temperature. A few degrees of change can unravel everything. As winters shorten and snowfall becomes less reliable, ski seasons compress, stranding whole economies built on 3 months of powder. Resorts at lower altitudes now invest in artificial snow machines, but even that solution has limits. When temperatures stay too warm, machines can only produce mist. A landscape once defined by certainty, snow on the peaks, income in winter, now faces instability on both fronts. Geographers studying these places use a variety of clues to distinguish temporary silence from terminal stillness. Employment data, for instance, forms a clear wave pattern in healthy seasonal economies. Sharp rises during the busy months followed by steady off-season lows. When that wave flattens entirely, it signals trouble, a lack of seasonal rebound. Retail tenancy is another subtle barometer. If storefronts reopen each year with familiar names, it's rhythm. If they remain empty or change hands repeatedly, it's erosion of another kind. Even school calendars play their part. When local education shifts to accommodate tourism, holding classes through winter instead of summer, it's a sign of adaptation rather than collapse. Still, numbers can't quite capture the sensory geography of these places when the crowds leave. Picture a seafront in January. The pier creaks in the wind. Gulls trace lazy circles over the water, unhurried by competition. Shop awnings flap like tired flags, and the only footprints in the sand belong to dogs and the occasional jogger. Streetlights flicker to life in the afternoon because the sun slips away so early. The town isn't dead, it's hibernating, its heartbeat slowed to match the season. Tourism is often called a mirage economy because it projects abundance that vanishes when the heat fades, but in truth, it's more like a tide, an oscillation between presence and absence. The challenge for planners is to keep that rhythm sustainable. Some towns diversify by hosting festivals or conferences in off months, while others turn to digital nomads or retirees seeking tranquility. The goal isn't to erase seasonality, but to soften its extremes, to let the ebb and flow continue without pulling the community apart. Technology now makes these cycles visible in ways that maps once couldn't. Satellite imagery shows how nighttime brightness swells like a pulse along coastlines each summer, then fades to scattered dots in winter. From orbit, you can literally watch cities inhale and exhale light. The most resilient ones show a gentle flicker rather than a sharp blink. Steady cores of habitation surrounded by luminous halos that appear and vanish like clockwork. There's something strangely comforting about this rhythm. It reminds us that not all silence means loss. A resort town in winter has its own beauty, a kind of geography of pause. Without the crowds, its physical shape becomes visible again. The curve of the bay, the pattern of rooftops, the quiet authority of the sea. The gulls still keep schedule, circling where the promenade meets the wind, as if to remind everyone that life here has always followed the seasons. The real danger isn't emptiness, it's forgetting that emptiness has purpose. The world needs places that rest, that breathe between bursts of activity. Seasonal cities, in their alternating fullness and quiet, reflect a truth about geography itself. Everything moves in cycles. Tides, tourists, economies, all ebb and return. And in those months of calm, when only the gulls and the waves remain, the land remembers its older rhythm. Long before postcards, before hotels, before summer itself. Absence can be as revealing as presence, if you know how to look for it. To the untrained eye, an abandoned district or fading town may seem still, but to geographers, its quiet has a texture. You can measure decline not just by what's missing, but by what stays visible when everything else stops moving. The Earth, observed from above, keeps an extraordinarily honest record of our comings and goings. One of the most telling tools is the study of night lights, the glow of human activity captured by satellites orbiting the planet every evening. If you've ever seen a composite image of the world at night, it's an almost poetic map of civilization. Constellations of cities, highways tracing silver lines between them, and the faint glow of fishing fleets at sea. But look at the same place across time, and the poetry becomes data. A steady dimming in a particular area can mean depopulation, people moving away, businesses closing, infrastructure losing power. Episodic outages, by contrast, suggest instability rather than emptiness. A blackout after a storm, a temporary economic shock, or conflict. The difference between gradual fade and flicker tells a story about endurance. Researchers often compare these light maps year by year to trace how human settlement expands, contracts, or shifts. In regions like northern Japan after the 2011 tsunami, or Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, scientists could literally see recovery unfold in the returning brightness. In others, such as shrinking industrial belts, the dimming was permanent. The beauty of this technique is that anyone can observe it. Many public satellite platforms offer free access to these nightlight layers. With a few clicks, you can watch entire regions breathe, their light patterns waxing and waning like the tide. Another way to spot absence is through building footprint datasets, digital outlines of every roof, derived from aerial photography or laser scans. Comparing these with population registers or census data reveals a lot about density versus occupation. If the built area keeps growing but the number of residents stagnates or declines, something isn't aligning. It may indicate speculative construction, slow sales, or migration away. This mismatch is the statistical fingerprint of a ghost district, one that exists on paper and pavement, but not yet in life. Even within standing neighbourhoods, smaller clues tell the tale. Property databases can show parcel churn, the rate at which addresses change hands or fall vacant. In healthy markets, there's movement but continuity. A house sold, another bought, a new business replacing an old one. In declining areas, the pattern breaks. Addresses drop off official rolls, postal deliveries decrease, and storefronts remain shuttered month after month. To geographers, this administrative silence is as loud as any collapse. A post office serving fewer households year after year becomes a barometer of retreat. From above, the land itself begins to take over the story. Vegetation encroachment is one of the most striking visual markers of absence. Paved surfaces, when unmaintained, invite life back almost immediately. Weeds sprout in cracks, moss softens rooftops, and tree lines creep along abandoned railways like green tides reclaiming ground. In high-resolution imagery, these encroachments form distinct textures, jagged, organic shapes cutting across the rigid geometry of roads and plots. In places like Detroit or the former mining towns of Eastern Europe, remote sensing teams have tracked urban rewilding. By measuring the expansion of tree canopy over time, it's the quiet revenge of nature, pixel by pixel. Roof decay offers another subtle but reliable indicator. In infrared satellite imagery, fresh roofs reflect light differently from weathered or collapsed ones. Over years, a gradual shift in reflectance suggests neglect. Analysts can even distinguish between tin, tile, and asphalt surfaces to assess which materials are breaking down fastest. In combination with ground data, water leaks, power line records, or service calls, these signs create a multi-dimensional portrait of decline. It's not morbid, it's diagnostic. Every pattern of decay helps explain how human systems age and adapt. For those curious to try this kind of observation themselves, there's a surprisingly gentle entry point. Platforms like Google Earth, NASA's World View, or the European Space Agency's Sentinel Hub allow you to explore time series, historical imagery layers that stretch back decades. By toggling between years, you can literally see change unfold. Lakes swelling and shrinking, new highways cutting through fields, rooftops darkening or disappearing. Try focusing on small details. A shopping mall that loses cars in its parking lot, a housing estate where lawns turn patchy, a rail yard overtaken by grass. These are the subtle cartographies of time. Overlaying old maps adds another layer of insight. Many cities and regions have open archives of historical cartography, from 19th century surveys to Cold War era topographic sheets. Aligning these with modern satellite imagery can reveal dramatic shifts. A river that once bordered a town may now run kilometres away. An entire industrial zone may have turned into woodland. Even the change in street names tell stories of repurposing. An ironworks road, that now leads to a shopping centre, a harbour lane that ends in dry land. The ghost of function lingers in the toponyms. For scientists, these methods form the backbone of spatial analysis, but for the curious observer, they're also an invitation to slow down and see the world differently. A faded field boundary or an uneven patch of forest might look ordinary, but when you compare it across time, it becomes evidence of transformation. Geography, unlike history, records everything at once, the new layered directly atop the old. Learning to read that layering turns maps from static pictures into stories in motion. There's something almost meditative about tracing absence. You begin to notice the patterns that decline leaves behind, the gradual fade of light, the fuzz of vegetation, the scattering of addresses. They're not signs of failure so much as the natural exhalation of human geography, the reminder that no settlement, no matter how grand, exists outside time. Cities grow, stall, and recede like tides. Their remains are simply another texture of the Earth's surface. And perhaps that's the quiet revelation behind these digital tools. They don't just show where people live, they show where we've been and where we've stepped away. The satellites circling high above capture every flicker of human presence and every shadow of its absence, painting an ever-changing map of habitation. Look closely and you can almost hear the world breathing, brightening, dimming, and waiting for the next spark of life to appear. When people leave, the world doesn't stop, it exhales. The walls still stand, the rain still falls, and the quiet machinery of nature begins to hum again. What follows is not decay, but renewal, slow and unhurried. Ecologists call it succession, the step-by-step recolonization of space by life. But to watch it unfold in an empty street or a forgotten industrial site feels more like time in reverse, civilization dissolving back into landscape. The first arrivals are the smallest and least fussy. Mosses, lichens, and wind-blown seeds settle wherever a crack, gutter, or rooftop can hold a drop of moisture. They don't need soil, they make it, breaking down stone and collecting dust until a thin layer of earth appears. In just a few seasons, a concrete ledge can host its own miniature meadow. These pioneers are the same species that colonize volcanic slopes or glacier forelands. To them, a city is simply another type of cliff. Soon after, grasses and wildflowers join the invasion. Their roots work gently through asphalt seams, widening every fracture. On rooftops, rain gathers in low spots, forming shallow pools where algae bloom in emerald streaks. From above, abandoned neighbourhoods begin to resemble mosaics of green and grey, urban camouflage returning to its natural palette. For wildlife, these places become corridors. Foxes slip along railway embankments that now double as overgrown highways. Birds nest in traffic lights and cracked facades, their songs echoing through canyons of glass. In some post-industrial areas, nature even invents habitats that never existed before. Flooded basements and car parks, long since cut off from drainage, become makeshift wetlands. Amphibians arrive first, drawn by still water and shelter from predators. Insects follow, then bats, swooping at dusk through broken windows. Abandoned warehouses become ideal roosts, high, dry, and undisturbed. The same concrete that once repelled life turns into refuge. As years pass, the process deepens. Shrubs take root where moss once grew, and trees follow them, their roots lifting pavements like the fingers of a giant. In cities such as Leipzig and Detroit, ecologists have documented entire forests sprouting on derelict lots within 2 decades. What was once vacant land becomes an urban woodland, rich in biodiversity, a patchwork of birch, poplar, and willow. The irony is that these accidental forests often support more species than the manicured parks nearby. Left alone, even the most artificial environments find their way back to complexity. But the return of nature also brings questions of memory. Not every ruin is meant to vanish completely. Some are preserved deliberately, as caution, commemoration, or testament. The bombed church in Berlin left standing as a war memorial. The shells of Ordos-sur-Glane in France kept untouched since 1944. These sites represent a decision to let time stop, to let decay itself speak. Moss is allowed to grow, but not too much. The balance between erosion and remembrance becomes an act of curation. Elsewhere, reuse replaces preservation. Old factories become art spaces. Water towers transform into apartments. Gasworks re-emerge as public parks. The geography of abandonment turns out to be fertile ground for creativity. The Tate Modern in London, once a power station, now hums with quiet conversation instead of turbines. In the Ruhr Valley, former coal mines have been turned into green corridors, their chimneys wrapped in ivy and illuminated at night. These reinventions do not erase the past, they fold it into new purpose. Every material tells its own story as it changes. Lime leaches from plaster in slow tears, tracing pale veins down walls. Iron blooms into rust, a soft red that spreads like moss across beams and girders. Salt crystals form in patterns too intricate to design, growing out of damp brick like frost. Each reaction is chemistry as poetry, the building remembering what it once was, molecule by molecule. Architects sometimes call this the patina of time, but it's really the physics of memory written on stone and steel. Even the smells of these places shift, from paint and fuel to earth and rain. The air becomes heavier, cooler, alive again. Water seeps through old pipes and finds its way along forgotten conduits, tracing the city's hidden veins. In the quiet, you begin to hear the small sounds that urban life usually drowns out. The whisper of wind through broken glass, the rustle of grass where carpet once lay. Ecologists studying succession in abandoned sites often note how similar it is to processes after wildfire or flood. Disturbance resets the stage, and life begins anew in miniature, guided by chance and resilience. Pioneer species give way to settlers, settlers to specialists, until a new equilibrium emerges, not the same as before, but equally complete. In human landscapes, this progression carries a peculiar grace. The built environment doesn't vanish, it participates. A brick wall becomes a cliff, a drain becomes a stream, a courtyard becomes a meadow. In cities that have partially emptied, such as those affected by industrial decline, this rewilding can even become part of urban planning. Vacant parcels are left open to spontaneous vegetation, forming green belts that cool the air and absorb rainwater. Scientists call them novel ecosystems, nature and infrastructure coexisting in forms never seen before. It's a reminder that wilderness isn't always distant or pristine. Sometimes it's right behind a chain-link fence, quietly thriving. And yet, amid this renewal, human memory lingers. The outlines of streets remain etched in the undergrowth, visible after rain as parallel lines of gravel and moss. Trees align themselves along old foundations. Even when the city disappears completely, its geometry persists. The faint order of intention beneath the randomness of growth. You can sense where the square once stood, where the road curved toward the river. The landscape becomes a palimpsest, written over but never entirely erased. The poetry of such places lies in their patience. They remind us that abandonment is not the same as extinction. What we call decay is simply transition, materials finding new equilibrium, life reclaiming old space. Long after humans move on, cities continue to breathe in different ways. Their steel rusts into soil, their concrete softens into sand, and their silence fills with birdsong. In the end, ecological succession is not just a scientific process, but a gentle lesson in humility. The Earth doesn't need permission to recover, it only needs time, and given enough of it, even the most rigid geometry of human design will bend toward the curve of nature. What begins as ruin becomes habitat, what fades becomes fertile, and what we once called empty turns out to be quietly full of roots, of wings, and of memory. When people leave, the world doesn't stop, it exhales. The walls still stand, the rain still falls, and the quiet machinery of nature begins to hum again. What follows is not decay but renewal, slow and unhurried. Ecologists call it succession, the step-by-step recolonization of space by life. But to watch it unfold in an empty street or a forgotten industrial site feels more like time in reverse, civilization dissolving back into landscape. The first arrivals are the smallest and least fussy. Mosses, lichens, and wind-blown seeds settle wherever a crack, gutter, or rooftop can hold a drop of moisture. They don't need soil, they make it, breaking down stone and collecting dust until a thin layer of earth appears. In just a few seasons, a concrete ledge can host its own miniature meadow. These pioneers are the same species that colonize volcanic slopes or glacier forelands. To them, a city is simply another type of cliff. Soon after, grasses and wildflowers join the invasion. Their roots work gently through asphalt seams, widening every fracture. On rooftops, rain gathers in low spots, forming shallow pools where algae bloom in emerald streaks. From above, abandoned neighbourhoods begin to resemble mosaics of green and grey, urban camouflage returning to its natural palette. For wildlife, these places become corridors. Foxes slip along railway embankments that now double as overgrown highways. Birds nest in traffic lights and cracked facades, their songs echoing through canyons of glass. In some post-industrial areas, nature even invents habitats that never existed before. Flooded basements and car parks, long since cut off from drainage, become makeshift wetlands. Amphibians arrive first, drawn by still water and shelter from predators. Insects follow, then bats, swooping at dusk through broken windows. Abandoned warehouses become ideal roosts, high, dry, and undisturbed. The same concrete that once repelled life turns into refuge. As years pass, the process deepens. Shrubs take root where moss once grew, and trees follow them, their roots lifting pavements like the fingers of a giant. In cities such as Leipzig and Detroit, ecologists have documented entire forests sprouting on derelict lots within 2 decades. What was once vacant land becomes an urban woodland rich in biodiversity, a patchwork of birch, poplar, and willow. The irony is that these accidental forests often support more species than the manicured parks nearby. Left alone, even the most artificial environments find their way back to complexity. But the return of nature also brings questions of memory. Not every ruin is meant to vanish completely. Some are preserved deliberately as caution, commemoration, or testament. The bombed church in Berlin left standing as a war memorial. The shells of Oradour-sur-Glane in France kept untouched since 1944. These sites represent a decision to let time stop, to let decay itself speak. Moss is allowed to grow, but not too much. The balance between erosion and remembrance becomes an act of curation. Elsewhere, reuse replaces preservation. Old factories become art spaces, water towers transform into apartments, gasworks re-emerge as public parks. The geography of abandonment turns out to be fertile ground for creativity. The Tate Modern in London, once a power station, now hums with quiet conversation instead of turbines. In the Ruhr Valley, former coal mines have been turned into green corridors, their chimneys wrapped in ivy and illuminated at night. These reinventions do not erase the past, They fold it into new purpose. Every material tells its own story as it changes. Lime leaches from plaster in slow tiers, tracing pale veins down walls. Iron blooms into rust, a soft red that spreads like moss across beams and girders. Salt crystals form in patterns too intricate to design, growing out of damp brick like frost. Each reaction is chemistry as poetry, the building remembering what it once was, molecule by molecule. Architects sometimes call this the patina of time, but it's really the physics of memory written on stone and steel. Even the smells of these places shift, from paint and fuel to earth and rain. The air becomes heavier, cooler, alive again. Water seeps through old pipes and finds its way along forgotten conduits, tracing the city's hidden veins. In the quiet, you begin to hear the small sounds that urban life usually drowns out. The whisper of wind through broken glass, the rustle of grass where carpet once lay. Ecologists studying succession in abandoned sites often note how similar it is to processes after wildfire or flood. Disturbance resets the stage, and life begins anew in miniature, guided by chance and resilience. Pioneer species give way to settlers, settlers to specialists, until a new equilibrium emerges, not the same as before, but equally complete. In human landscapes, this progression carries a peculiar grace. The built environment doesn't vanish, it participates. A brick wall becomes a cliff, a drain becomes a stream, a courtyard becomes a meadow. In cities that have partially emptied, such as those affected by industrial decline, this rewilding can even become part of urban planning. Vacant parcels are left open to spontaneous vegetation, forming green belts that cool the air and absorb rainwater. Scientists call them novel ecosystems, nature and infrastructure coexisting in forms never seen before. It's a reminder that wilderness isn't always distant or pristine. Sometimes it's right behind a chain-link fence quietly thriving. And yet, amid this renewal, human memory lingers. The outlines of streets remain etched in the undergrowth, visible after rain as parallel lines of gravel and moss. Trees align themselves along old foundations. Even when the city disappears completely, its geometry persists. The faint order of intention beneath the randomness of growth. You can sense where the square once stood, where the road curved toward the river. The landscape becomes a palimpsest, written over but never entirely erased. The poetry of such places lies in their patience. They remind us that abandonment is not the same as extinction. What we call decay is simply transition. Materials finding new equilibrium, life reclaiming old space. Long after humans move on, cities continue to breathe in different ways. Their still rusts into soil, their concrete softens into sand, and their silence fills with birdsong. In the end, ecological succession is not just a scientific process, but a gentle lesson in humility. The Earth doesn't need permission to recover, it only needs time. And given enough of it, even the most rigid geometry of human design will bend toward the curve of nature. What begins as ruin becomes habitat, what fades becomes fertile, and what we once called empty turns out to be quietly full of roots, of wings, and of memory. When people withdraw, nature does not hesitate, it advances. A city without its citizens does not simply crumble, it transforms. The stillness that follows departure fills quickly with life, and the first signs of return are delicate. A scrap of moss in a pavement crack, a fern unfurling in a gutter, a fox slipping down a railway line under cover of night. Ecological succession is not destruction reversed, but a quiet rehearsal for a new world, one built from what remains. The earliest colonizers are invisible workers. Algae and lichens start the process by dissolving minerals from stone, their tiny roots producing the first grains of soil. Dust drifts in, mixing with pollen and rain to make a thin, gritty skin where seeds can rest. Within a few years, weeds, then grasses, take hold. Their roots drive into mortar, breaking apart walls that once kept life out. A brick ledge becomes a meadow in miniature. Concrete roofs, warmed by sun and cooled by rain, support wildflowers as vivid as any mountain slope. Soon, animals follow. Birds rediscover nesting hollows in rafters and chimneys, their songs echoing where traffic once droned. Bats roost in warehouse ceilings, feasting on insects drawn to pools of water left by leaky roofs. Foxes and raccoons move along disused railway lines like travellers through a forest trail. These abandoned infrastructures form perfect wildlife corridors, ribbons of safety through a patchwork of concrete and grass. Water, ever opportunistic, plays its part. Basements flood and turn into cool urban wetlands. Car parks collect puddles that grow reeds and mosquitoes. What was once waste space becomes refuge. Herons, frogs, even otters have been seen exploring these accidental habitats. Cities, when left alone, don't simply decay, they ferment, evolving their own ecosystems. Yet the story's not just biological. It's also about memory and choice. Some ruins are allowed to fade naturally, others are preserved as symbols. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane in France remain frozen as a wartime memorial, cars rusting in place beneath wildflowers, silence serving as testimony. Elsewhere, people practice adaptive reuse. Gasworks turned into gardens, factories reborn as galleries, steel mills transformed into parks. Each approach reflects a different philosophy, whether to let time have the last word or to collaborate with it. Meanwhile, the materials themselves continue to tell stories. Rain leaches lime from plaster, tracing pale veins down walls. Iron turns to russet dust, blooming in slow, powdery patterns. Salt crystals creep from brickwork like frost, glinting when the sun catches them. Even decay follows laws of chemistry, predictable yet strangely beautiful. What humans built to resist nature becomes a canvas for it. Walk through such a place and the air feels different, damp, mineral, alive. The scent of rust mingles with earth. The temperature drops where moss has cooled the walls. Every sound seems amplified. The drip of water, the flutter of wings, the whisper of leaves through shattered windows. You could call it ruin, but it feels more like recovery. Ecologists studying these environments find parallels with post-wildfire landscapes. Both begin as blank slates, repopulated step by step. Pioneers, settlers, specialists. In abandoned cities, each new layer of growth conceals and protects the one beneath. A courtyard becomes woodland, a roof garden becomes soil. Nature does not restore what was before, it invents something new. A hybrid ecosystem stitched together from steel, clay, and chlorophyll. Urban planners now study these successions not as curiosities but as models. Vacant land is left unpaved to let spontaneous vegetation filter rain and cool the air. Trees seeded by chance are kept rather than cleared. These novel ecosystems may look untidy, but they work, absorbing carbon, sheltering wildlife, reminding us that wilderness can exist in the middle of a city. Even after total abandonment, the geometry of humanity lingers. Streets persist as faint ridges in the undergrowth. Trees align along old property lines. Satellite images reveal the ghost grid beneath the forest, like a fingerprint of former intention. Memory survives in form long after names and purposes fade. Perhaps that is the most poetic truth of all, that absence does not mean emptiness. The planet continues to write its own story atop ours. Concrete softens into dust, steel returns to ore, and silence fills with life. The ruins hum again, not with engines or crowds, but with the patient rhythm of renewal. What seems like the end is merely the earth resuming its conversation. with rain, with roots, and with time itself. Cities like living things breathe. They expand with ambition, pause in stillness, and exhale when time asks them to. Across centuries, every street and skyline has followed that rhythm. A steady inhale of growth, a quiet hold of stability, and the long, slow release that gives way to change. We like to think of cities as permanent, solid, eternal things, but really, they're as alive and as fragile as the people who build them. If you remember the image from the beginning, that single lamp glowing in an empty window, it captures the whole story. A city is never truly lifeless, even when the crowd has gone. Somewhere, a light still burns. It might belong to a caretaker, a returning family, or simply a reflection of the moon on glass. That small glimmer is what connects every ghost street, every abandoned square, every tower left to wind and dust. It's a reminder that even in silence, the human presence endures, as memory, as architecture, as the faint geometry of hope. Throughout this journey, we've wandered through many versions of absence. Ancient cities slowly fading beneath sand, industrial towns that ran out of coal or purpose, modern skylines waiting for residents who have not yet arrived. We've seen streets drawn off the map by disaster, or held in place by borders and ceasefires, and through them all runs a common thread. Geography never stops moving. Mountains erode, rivers shift, climates turn, and economies follow. What we call abandonment is often just an intermission in the longer play between people and place. Sometimes that pause lasts centuries. In Petra or Pompeii, silence became preservation, time holding its breath so the future could look back. In Pripyat or Varosha, absence became a lesson in how thin the line between safety and stillness can be. And in the deserts of Inner Mongolia or the suburbs of Parisian replicas in Zhejiang, we learned that emptiness can be temporary, that cities can lie dormant, waiting for their second act. The earth is generous with do-overs, even if they take a while to arrive. There's a strange beauty in that resilience. When lights fade, nature takes over the night shift. Moss and ivy thread through concrete, foxes and birds reclaim old railways, and even flooded basements find purpose as wetlands. Decay is never just loss, it's the opening scene of renewal. Every cracked pavement and rusted beam is a quiet collaboration between what humans built and what the planet patiently edits. Over time, the boundary blurs until you can't tell where architecture ends and landscape begins. For all our planning and precision, geography has the last word. Dams drown towns, deltas sink under salt, coasts retreat, and snowless winters rewrite mountain economies. But just as often, we adapt, we rebuild, relocate, reinvent. Cities breathe out, and new ones breathe in. The cycle continues, each inhale shaped by the exhale before it. That is why maps never stay still. They are living records of our negotiations with the earth. And perhaps that's the comfort in studying ghost cities. They remind us that even when the lights go out, the story doesn't end. Streets may fall silent, but they're never forgotten. Somewhere beneath new foundations lie the outlines of the old. Invisible layers that tell us we've been here before, that leaving and returning are both part of the same geography. The places we lose shape the places we build next. So tonight, as you listen and the world outside slows, think of the planet as one vast city, breathing in and out, growing and resting. From the oldest ruins to the quietest suburbs, it all moves to the same rhythm. The lamp in the window may flicker, but it never quite goes dark. Thank you for joining this journey through silence and space, through the rise and rest of human places. I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? It's always a wonder to see this quiet community stretch across so many latitudes, linked by curiosity and calm. If this story helped you unwind or sparked a little thought about the landscapes that outlast us, a gentle like or a small subscribe means a great deal. To those already part of the Sleepy Geographer family, thank you. You're the reason these slow journeys continue to find their way into the world. Now, as the lamp dims and the map fades back into darkness, take one last deep breath with the Earth itself. The slow, patient rhythm of a planet always rebuilding, always remembering, always alive.